Hello and welcome to another episode of It Came From the Page. And today we are talking about a little author you may have heard of and ranking all of his books in celebration of Garbaugust. If you couldn't tell from the title, we are talking about the works of one Richard Bachman. As you can see, there's a photo of Richard Bachman right there. So he wrote a number of books, and then he just happened to, disappear. Even some of his work got a Stephen King. Writing is Richard... Oh. Yes, if you didn't know, Richard Bachman was an early pseudonym for Stephen King, and that author photo I showed you, yeah, that was just a photo of a man named Richard Manuel, who was the insurance agent of a man named Kirby McCallie, who was King's literary agent. So, secrets out. If you didn't know, Richard Bachman and Stephen King are one and the same. I have seen a number of people kind of talk about and read certain Stephen King books for Garbaugust. And there's been kind of a discussion about what is King very eligible for Garbaugust when you're talking about it. I know another Boobiephile read Carrie, for example. I would not put that in trash. I love Carrie. I think it's a great book. But if we're going to talk about any work of Mr. King and put it in the trash category, we would have to talk about the work of one Richard Bachman. This is a pseudonym he used. And there are some very fascinating things in this category of books. I wanted to make this video for a while, and I kept putting it off, and I then had to do an immense amount of audiobook listening in order to prepare. So there was a few of these books that I just learned about and just read recently. So the majority of this is all very fresh in my old noggin. We are going to do a ranking of worst to best. So these are my least favorites going all the way to my favorites. There is some really interesting stuff in here, so let's just kind of talk about it. First off, my worst Richard Bachman book is The Running Man. Now, this is the movie tie-in version of The Running Man, and I love the movie The Running Man. I think The Running Man is a very fun, interesting movie that's trying to talk about television and our relationship with it by also being a really, really fun, silly, cheesy action flick. The Running Man novel, the book that's inside of this, is just unbearable. We have some of King's worst examples of just racism. He's trying to talk about racism, but it's in that early period of King where he has not met too many black people because every time he writes a person of color, it's bad. And that's in here. Also, our main character is just completely unlikable. Ben Richards is an absolute nightmare of a human being. He has nothing about him that you want to see continue. A character does not have to be likable in order to, make a book worth reading. But there is nothing to this character that's even remotely interesting even to make you want to follow his journey. This is Stephen King writing a dystopia, and it's funny because, as you'll see much later on in this video, he does have the ability to write dystopia well. I just think that this is not that. This is a very lean book, and it's very character-focused, and you're just following Ben Richards as he kind of goes on and does all of his stuff. And it's not interesting. The action is not very well done. I don't think, everything the movie does that I like, the book does not do. You don't get any personality from the people chasing him. The main plot is he is on this television show where he runs and he gets free roam of the entire country, and basically people are hunting him. He has to send in tapes every so often to the executives, and they air that on television, and he gets more money the longer he can stay alive as people are hunting him to the death. You don't get much of anything for any of the people who are hunting him. You get a very, very little of it at the end, and it's just not very satisfying, not very good, not very enjoyable. Altogether, one of the maybe my least favorite King book that I've ever read. I don't think there's much to recommend for that. So if you want to experience The Running Man, watch the movie. skip the book. This is one of the very few examples of a movie being better than the book. Next up, the one that you probably thought was going to be at the bottom, and I do not blame you for thinking that. Let's just talk about it. This obviously is my big collection of the Bachman books, but this is the only way that you can affordably find the book Rage, which was so Running Man 1982, Rage was 1977. King actually wrote Rage when he was in high school. You can tell. And also, one of the things about this book is no longer in print. And it's no longer in print for a very, very good reason. And that's because when Rage was written, school shootings were an abnormality. Like, this is not something that was happening in everyday society at the time. As the years went on, it started to become more and more common. And because of the way Rage is written and what someone could pick up from Rage, you started to find multiple school shooters had copies of Rage when it started to kind of kick off in much, much later down the line from when the book was published. So King decided to just stop reprinting this particular novel. As such, those collections of the Bachman books are really the only way you can find it affordable. And if you want to get like a first edition, it is the most expensive King book possible. So it is a book that's very hard to find. And what King has always said about it is he doesn't believe that art causes school shootings or violence or anything like that. And I agree. He just said this particular book could act as an accelerant. And he just said, hey, let's just take this out of print. Like it's not worth it. And it doesn't hurt the fact that it's a terrible book. It is not a very good book. But the reason why I put it above Running Man is because there are segments and sections in this book that I find really, really compelling. So essentially, the story is a kid shows up in his classroom, shoots his teacher, and then holds his class hostage. And the entire book is kind of him talking to these kids and talking about all these different ideas and thoughts that he has and why he's here and why he's doing what he's doing. And also you get some flashbacks and you kind of get some information as to why he is the way he is. A lot of that is really badly written, right? Because he's kind of written as the hero in a very odd way. And the only character who is understandably opposed to this character and is kind of thinking rationally throughout this entire hostage situation is painted as the villain. And it's a very strange scenario. It's very hard to figure out what exactly is kind of going on in this book as far as what are we kind of supposed to take away from this book. It's kind of sloppy in that regard. I do think, though, there are a few chapters. I would particularly point out the flashback chapters. I found some of the flashback chapters where you learn about his father and his family life and all of that to at least be interesting, compelling. There's some really good things in that book that stuck with me, things that I thought about after I read it. The Running Man, I don't think I will have anything that lingers with me after reading it. The Rage is a few chapters here and there that do have some worthwhile merit to them, and you can see the building blocks for where Stephen King would go in the future. That's why I put it above The Running Man. I understand why it's the worst in most people's categories, and I don't necessarily agree. We're talking like differences of one ranking. That's about it. I just think that there are a few interesting things in Rage. Next up, third worst, Roadwork. Roadwork? Oh man. Roadwork is a book that I've been kind of trying to avoid for ages. Oh god. I knew that Roadwork was going to be bad. I knew what Roadwork was kind of in a degree, and it is one of those books that is a terrible book. Like it's a very bad book. It has a lot of questionable bad things in it, but it's also very, very readable and very fun to read. It is trash, though. You have to kind of go into this being like, oh, this is not a good book, and enjoy the badness of it, I would say. I would still say it's a bad book. Obviously, I've said that word multiple times in this ranking already. Roadwork is essentially like the epitome of like white male rage. It is this middle-aged guy who finds out that a freeway is going to be built in his particular area, and he has to move. He has to be relocated of his house. They're going to pay him to relocate his house. And then his job is at this laundromat that also has to be relocated. And he just has a mental breakdown, essentially, and refuses. And it's all about his stand against the government. And, you know, it's a book. It's a book. It is 90% middle-aged white man rants. Like, so much of this book is just ranting, and it's funny in a way because you like read it and you're like, this guy sucks. Like, he is not like, what's going on here? Like, why are we following this particular character? Barton George Dawes, like the main character of this book, is just like this. It's just he doesn't know why he's doing what he's doing. And I think that's one of the things that doesn't make this book that compelling, because I don't think King knows either. I don't think King knows why the guy is doing what he's doing. And it's basically another book about just a guy who won't go to therapy. In many ways, this seems to be like a precursor to things like Falling Down, which is a awful movie that just seems to kind of have the same kind of connections as this book does, in that it's just all about this like middle class white man rage. I usually kind of can attach to books that are clearly written from a perspective of anger and rage, not white male rage. I think it's like the least compelling way to format and talk about things that make you upset. And the fact that he's getting paid to like relocate, yeah, it sucks that he has to relocate, but it's not like things that have happened to like communities that like, you know, like being disposed and treated as trash by the government, right? Like there are ways that you could write a similar story but have it not be from a middle class white man's perspective, and it would be a lot more compelling. Now this was a book that was kind of written because King was grieving the loss of his mother, right? So there's a lot of interesting stuff in regards to grief in there. And as such, there are a few interesting chapters and a few interesting stories throughout that are at the very least enjoyable to read and are interesting. There is a awful female character in this book. Like, the female character in this book is maybe one of the worst female characters that King has written, especially because of things that happen to her and how our main character like responds to what she does and how she acts. It's to talk about this book too much longer would start to sound like a chapter in Roadwork, because I would just be another white male ranting. So let's go on. We are finally at books that I do actually like. So now we are getting on to the one of the last books that were written under Bachman, but not the last one, and that is The Regulators. This is the sister book to Desperation. I have not actually read Desperation. I am interested to read Desperation eventually. I know that's supposed to be a pretty good book. This is like a book that I quite enjoy, but there are some big asterisks to that. So the main plot of this is pretty much where the asterisks come from, because you have a child who is autistic who gets taken over by an evil force, and he loves Westerns and he loves Power Rangers, essentially, and he uses the evil villain uses his powers to make it so that all of a sudden the entire neighborhood comes under assault and gets blocked off and just becomes this huge warring hell zone. And that part is so fun. It's so fun and it's so wild. The big issues with this book, though, is that core concept, in that, you know, it's another example of a magical autistic character. And it's just, it's a trope that King uses a lot. uses to varying degrees. There are some books where I think he does do it well. I don't necessarily like the way he does it here. And it's a big part of the book, obviously, because that's the central villain is this kid, and also the thing that kicks off all the events and everything like that. It's also an extremely mean book. I didn't mention that before in the other ones. You could probably tell, but yeah, Richard Bachman in general, when King is writing under the Bachman name, he is kind of an asshole. Like it's all kind of like very dark and very moody and wild, and he's not very sentimental, and that's something that's very different from other King books, because King usually does a lot of sentiment in his books. And one of the things that is such a good thing about Stephen King as a writer is that he really connects you with characters, and you kind of know everything about them, and you like the characters. Most characters in Bachman books are not. They are not very well drawn, and they are not extremely likable in any way. You don't really understand what they're doing, which is sometimes a big issue with some of these books. The Regulators, though, aside with a huge asterisk to that, the main thrust of the story behind the book, I found the madness that happens once everything kind of goes ham was delightful to read. We've got weird-looking condors, like flying condors. We've got wolves with human hands and gun belts. You've got big old Gila monsters. You have people in weird Power Ranger outfits. And it's all of these very, very weird things kind of being combined together and just destroying a town. And I absolutely enjoyed the madness of that, getting into the heads of the people who live in this neighborhood, who are being assaulted by, quite frankly, just madness. All of these things that happen to these people, and it's just a story about these people trying to survive while they're being assaulted by stuff they don't understand. And it is kind of really an interesting microcosm of a little neighborhood. A lot of the characters are kind of characters you've seen King do before, but it's always fun to see them again and in different scenarios. So I think that this book is really fun, and I do really like the action in this book. I love some of the crazy dark turns it takes. Don't love the central premise of the book. I also really don't like some of the stuff it does as far as like sexuality in the book and associated with that shot. Like it's very much like, I don't think we needed that, but it is there. It is there. It's iffy. But everything else, when you're just in the stories of the people trying to understand and survive the scenario, it is quite good. Next up, and the third best Richard Bachman book for me, is Thinner. So much like The Regulators, it also has a little bit of an asterisk to it. I guess this is just something that happened with good old Richard Bachman, is that most of his books are not holding up today and are borderline offensive. This one is very offensive to the Romani people and uses them and the quote-unquote curse that they do. I'm not going to say the word that they're called throughout this book, mainly because it's a slur. It's a slur. So make sure that if you're going to talk about a book like this, make sure when you mention the people who are the antagonists, quote-unquote, you say the Romani people. It's just nice and it's just correct. So just do that, please. So basically, this is a pretty straightforward horror story. The only straightforward horror story of the bunch, and it resulted in King getting ousted as Bachman. Because obviously it did. This is so clearly Kingian in its construction. And also there are literal references to the man himself. So Stephen King legitimately says at one point, "Oh, sounds like I'm in a Stephen King novel." And you're like, yeah, Stephen, do you wonder why you got ousted here? You couldn't resist. But other than that, basically a lawyer who has a weight issue. He hits a woman while he's getting a hand job from his wife in a car, as is the plot, and then he gets off and he is not found guilty, not even getting any demerit points on his license, and one of the Romani people who was like the father of the woman who was killed by him, curses him with one word, thinner, which just it starts resulting in this man starting to slowly lose weight. And as it goes on, he gets more gaunt, he gets thinner and thinner, obviously. And it is a very body horror centric story that works very well in that regard and is very harrowing. You can see this character who you think that you like, right? You think you like the main character of this book. You think he's a good guy. And then as things go on and as he slowly starts to like fall apart mentally and also fall apart as terms of just becoming like an emaciated as he gets thinner and thinner, he is not a good person. And you find out he has a lot of issues, and these are all kind of slowly bubbling up to the surface, right? So let's take a book like The Running Man. As page 1, you know the main character, the Running Man, is an asshole. It takes a while for you to really understand the depths of depravity that is our main character here, and why he is not as good of a person as he appears to be. It's just a great examination of a kind of a singular character, and also there are some fun ancillary curses that happen to other people involved in the case, and I say fun, but I mean horrible. Like, they're horrifying what happens to the other people who get likewise cursed. And then he decides that he has to go track down the Romani people, see if he cannot get this curse removed. He also gets the help of a mobster by the name of Richard Ginelli, and he is amazing. He is a wonderful, wonderful, stereotypical mob guy. And it's funny because Richard Ginelli is very much like a character in Roadwork, who also is a very generic mob guy. So I don't know why Bachman books are just like obsessed with the mob guy stereotype. But you get a lot more with Ginelli than you do with the character in Roadwork. And I had a really fun time with that character. There, near the end of this book, there are like chapters that are just him recounting what he's done, and a lot of people don't like those chapters. I found those chapters absolutely wonderful. I love those chapters. I love just being the head of this guy who is also a piece of shit, but he's a compelling piece of shit, and just how he does things was very, very entertaining. So yeah, as a whole, I would say Thinner is just a very depressing, interesting character study with a good horror premise that is well worth your time if you are all interested in it. And if you've only seen the movie, I like the movie too. I think the movie is quite good. That's a fairly good version of the story being adapted, but I do think the book itself is also quite good. I listened to this in an audiobook, and the audiobook is narrated by Joe Mantegna, who plays Richard Ginelli in the movie, so it was super fun to just have him outline this entire story. So if I was to do a recommendation, I would say Thinner is best in audio. The second best Bachman book, and the most recent Bachman book, is 2007's Blaze. I had no idea about what this book actually was before I read it this time. I had thought that it was a horror story, but it turns out this is just a crime book. My only criticism really of this book is that it shouldn't have been released under Richard Bachman's name. This is a trunk novel from Stephen King, which meant this is a book that he wrote ages ago. He wrote this in the 70s, and then he took it out, re-edited it, did another pass at it, and then released it as it is now. I think that probably that modern edit of it is why this book is much better than some of the other Bachman books, in that, it was looked at with a more mature eye from Stephen, Mr. King, and I think that might be why Blaze is as good as it is. It's also a Bachman book that is not that offensive, so it's really not much of a Bachman book at all, other than the fact that it's very focused on a singular character, and there's not a whole lot of sentimentality in this story. It doesn't feel a lot like his other works. I think you probably could have just released this under the King brand, and it would have still been good. This is, without a doubt, the least read Bachman book, if I were to guess. I've never heard anyone even talk about this book before, and as such, I'm only going to give you a very limited description of this, because this is one of those ones that I think is better to go in not knowing a whole lot. Basically the main plot is we are following our main character who had a brain injury when he was very young, and then he got into crime in his later years as he became an adult. He had an accomplice, and with his accomplice they would do various cons and things of that nature. His accomplice, who was a quote-unquote brains of the operation, died, and now he's kind of lost and floundering, trying to figure out what to do next. And he remembers that his partner always talked about the quote-unquote big score, which was essentially a Lindbergh baby-style kidnapping of a rich family's baby and then ransoming it back to them. So we follow this character as he goes about that scenario, how the aftermath is, does he succeed, how are everyone reacting to what happens in this event from his perspective, and it is all just really, really quite good and very compelling. I rarely go into a Stephen King book and not know anything about what's going to happen, and that's what happened here. And I think that's one of the benefits of Blaze. This is just a wonderful, interesting, complex, great, book about crime, and I think that this is a book that definitely should be more widely read. It's the least trash of all the Bachman books. Even my number one has some elements of trash in it, but this is just kind of a book that I bet you could have just released whenever, and I don't think it would even be thought of as trash at all unless somebody put it under the Bachman name, which is what you did. So it's an interesting tale to be kind of put in this collection because it's the least trashy of the bunch, and I just think it's a really good book. The best Bachman book is The Long Walk from 1979. This was written around the same time as Rage was written, which was a very young novel written by King, and I think it's a masterpiece. I think this is one of King's best works. I think it is a surprising work, especially given the fact that Rage was, to put it lightly, not a great book. And there are elements of this book that are very similar to The Running Man, and this is better than that by yards and leaps and everything like that. I think that The Long Walk is really an achievement, an early King, and should really be read along with his other 70s starter novels that are really great and had a big impact. I think that The Long Walk, whose plot is exceedingly simple, this is another dystopian novel, and the plot is as such. Every year, a group full of young boys have to walk as far and as long as they can, and as soon as they get behind and they stop walking, they get shot. And they have to keep up a certain pace or else they'll be shot, and it's basically a survival thing to see what boy can outlast all of the others. And it's just harrowing. It's a harrowing adventure. It's all very much in the head of these kids as they're walking and walking, and you feel the strain on them. You feel as they start to unravel, and how characters, scenarios, and relationships change, and these friendships you make along the way that are, by their very nature, doomed. And it's kind of all about, going into adulthood, essentially, in a very odd and interesting way, and just the ways that the world bears you down and tears you down. And it's a great book. It's a great, great book. If you've never read The Long Walk, I would 100% recommend it. And that is by far the best Stephen King book in my eyes. So, would love to hear from you guys. Did I get any of my rankings wrong in your opinion? Did you think that I maybe messed up the rankings in a few of these? What is your favorite Bachman book? Just let me know in the comments below. And I hope you guys have a great day. Goodbye.